ST1, the river that gives life. Before there were cities, before there were empires, before the wheel turned or the written word carved its first mark into stone, there was the Nile. It flooded, it receded, it fed, and from its banks a civilization rose that would outlast almost everything humanity has ever built. Egypt did not merely exist in time. Egypt defined time. It measured it, worshipped it, and feared its end. But among all the forces that moved through Egyptian life, war, religion, agriculture, death, none was more intimate, more terrifying, or more sacred than the moment a new life began to grow inside the body of a woman. Pregnancy in ancient Egypt was not simply a biological event. It was a cosmic act, a transaction between the human world and the divine one, a fragile thread connecting the living to the yet-to-be-born, the mortal woman to the immortal goddess, the family hearth to the eternal order of Ma'at, the universal principle of truth, balance, and harmony that governed all Egyptian existence. To understand what pregnancy meant in this civilization, we must step inside it completely. We must walk through the narrow streets of a village along the Nile Delta, where the air smells of wet clay and river reeds. We must enter the home of a woman who has just missed her monthly cycle and whose heart beats faster, not only with hope, but with a deep and ancient fear. We must listen to the whispered prayers she offers to Hathor, the goddess of love and fertility, whose face watches from the painted walls of temples that tower above the landscape like monuments to eternity. This is that story, the story of life before life, the story of what it meant to carry a child in the world's first great civilization. Asit 2, knowing before knowing. One of the most remarkable things about ancient Egypt is not its pyramids, not its golden death masks, not even its incomprehensible architectural precision. It is the sophistication of its medical knowledge, knowledge that predates modern understanding by thousands of years, and yet, in certain astonishing ways, anticipated it. The Egyptians were obsessed with the body. They mummified it. They studied it. They cataloged its ailments, its fluids, and its vulnerabilities, and when it came to the female body, they were extraordinarily attentive. The question of whether a woman was pregnant was not left to chance or assumption. Egyptian physicians, healers who occupied tremendous social respect, blending medicine with magic and ritual with reason, developed early pregnancy tests that are startling in their logic. The most famous of these tests appears in the Carlsberg Papyrus and the Berlin Medical Papyrus, documents dating to approximately 1350 BCE, though they likely preserved knowledge far older than the papyrus on which they were written. The test was this. A woman who suspected she might be pregnant would urinate on bags of barley and wheat seeds daily over several days. If the barley sprouted first, the child was believed to be male. If the wheat sprouted first, a girl. If neither sprouted, she was not pregnant. Extraordinarily, a scientific study conducted in 1963 found that this ancient test correctly detected actual pregnancy approximately 70% of the time. The hormonal changes in a pregnant woman's urine do, in fact, affect the germination of grain. The ancient Egyptians discovered this relationship not through chemistry or microscopes, but through careful, patient, generational observation of the natural world. There were other tests as well. Some physicians instructed women to place a clove of garlic inside the body overnight. If by morning the smell could be detected on the woman's breath, it signaled that her body's passages were open and vital, a sign of life circulating freely. If no smell reached the breath, there might be a blockage, a stagnation. And stagnation in the body to the Egyptian mind was always something to fear. These were not primitive guesses. They were the product of a civilization that believed nature, carefully observed, would reveal its secrets. And nature, more often than not, obliged them. ACT 3. The divine architecture of creation. To understand how a pregnant woman experienced her condition in ancient Egypt, you must first understand how the Egyptians understood creation itself. In the beginning, according to the Heliopolitan creation myth, there was only Nun, the dark, primordial waters of chaos. From those waters emerged Atum, the first god, who created himself out of nothing. And from the generations that followed came Nut, the goddess of the sky, who was eternally pregnant. Every night she swallowed the sun, Ra, and every morning she gave birth to him again, Paul pulling him from her body in a blaze of gold across the eastern horizon. She was depicted on the ceilings of tombs as a woman arching across the sky, her star-covered body vast and dark, her fingers and toes touching the four cardinal points of the world. When an Egyptian woman became pregnant, she entered, in a very real theological sense, the same sacred territory as Nut. She was nurturing life inside herself. She was preparing to push that life into the world, bleeding and gasping and triumphant. She was participating in the cosmic drama of creation. This was not metaphor to the Egyptians. This was literal theological reality. The goddess Hathor, whose name means House of Horus, was one of the most beloved figures in the entire Egyptian pantheon. She was the goddess of music, joy, and love, and crucially, but the protector of pregnant women and the divine midwife of royalty. In the birth stories of the pharaohs themselves, Hathor appeared alongside the frog goddess Heket to breathe life into the newborn divine child. In Egyptian homes, small figurines of Hathor and Heket were kept close to pregnant women. They were touched, prayed over, placed beneath pillows. They were not decorative objects. They were anchors, spiritual anchors connecting the frightened, hopeful woman to the eternal, indestructible world of the gods. Then there was Taweret, perhaps the most powerful protective presence in the world of Egyptian pregnancy. She appears almost alarming to modern eyes, the body of a hippopotamus, the tail of a crocodile, the paws of a lion, standing upright and heavily pregnant herself, her belly thrust forward, her expression fierce. She was terrifying precisely because she needed to be. She stood between the vulnerable pregnant woman and all the malevolent forces, demons, disease, evil spirits that sought to harm her or her child. Her grotesque body was her armor. Her ferocity was her gift. In nearly every Egyptian household of any economic standing, an amulet of Taweret could be found, carved from faience, ivory, or stone. Pregnant women wore them around their necks and placed them beside their beds. In the small hours of the night, when pain came and fear rose like floodwater, they held these objects and whispered her name. Act 4. Medicine, Magic, and the Body. Egyptian medicine existed in a space that modern minds sometimes struggle to inhabit. The space where empirical observation and supernatural belief were not opposites, but partners. A physician was also a priest. A prescription might include both a measurable herbal remedy and a spoken incantation. The physical and the metaphysical were aspects of a single, unified reality. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the most important medical documents ever discovered, dates to approximately 1550 BCE and contains a remarkable range of gynecological and obstetric knowledge. Within its pages are recommendations for stimulating milk production in nursing mothers, treatments for vaginal infections, instructions for managing difficult pregnancies, and guidance on the care of newborns. When a woman was pregnant, Egyptian physicians paid close attention to her diet. Honey, a substance of enormous symbolic and nutritional importance, was frequently prescribed. It was antibacterial, nutritious, and sacred, carrying associations with life and divine favor. Beer, the thin, lightly fermented grain drink that was the everyday beverage of virtually all Egyptians, was considered particularly important for pregnant women. Egyptian beer was far closer in nutritional value to a grain porridge than to modern alcoholic beverages, providing calories, B vitamins, and hydration in a world where clean water could not always be guaranteed. Certain plants and herbs were prescribed to ease the discomforts of pregnancy, to manage nausea, reduce swelling, and ease the cramping of the final months. Preparations made from figs, pomegranate, juniper, and various Nile plants appear throughout the medical texts. The line between herbal remedy and magical charm was, again, entirely fluid. A preparation might function as both medicine and spell simultaneously. There were things a pregnant woman was told to avoid: certain foods, certain activities, certain ritual spaces. She navigated a complex landscape of permissions and prohibitions, guided by the physician, the midwife, and the older women of her community who carried generations of accumulated wisdom in their memories. Dreams, too, were part of this world. In Egyptian culture, dreams were communications from the gods, from the dead, from the invisible forces that moved through existence. A pregnant woman who dreamed of a date palm was believed to be carrying a child destined for abundance. A dream involving the god Thoth might suggest a child of unusual intelligence. Dreams were discussed, interpreted, and taken seriously as part of the ongoing dialogue between the human world and the divine one. Act 5. The Weight of Royalty. For the common woman of ancient Egypt, the farmer's wife, the weaver's daughter, the fisherman's partner, pregnancy was intensely personal and deeply communal. She was surrounded by the women of her family and neighborhood. The midwife was known to her. The fear was real, but the community held it. For the women of the royal court, pregnancy was something else entirely. It was politics. It was power. It was the future of the civilization made flesh. The queen who carried the Pharaoh's child was not merely a woman expecting a baby. She was the vessel of dynastic continuity. In a civilization where the Pharaoh was not merely a king but a living god, the earthly manifestation of Horus, the child she carried, might one day govern the greatest empire on earth. The pressure was immeasurable, and the scrutiny was total. Royal pregnancies were attended by the finest physicians in the kingdom. Temples received offerings on the queen's behalf. Priests performed elaborate ritualdom. Temples received offerings on the queen's bay. The entire court held its collective breath. A son meant an heir. An heir meant continuity. Continuity meant that Ma'at, the cosmic order, would be preserved. If there was no son, or if sons died in childhood, as they so frequently did in a world without modern medicine, the consequences could be catastrophic. Dynasties ended not in battle, but in the silence of an empty nursery. Hatshepsut, the extraordinary woman who ruled Egypt as Pharaoh for over 20 years, had her divine birth inscribed on the walls of her magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri. The murals depict the god Amun himself, taking the form of her father to conceive her in her mother's womb. Her divine birth was not mythology to her people. It was legitimacy. It was the theological proof of her right to wear the double crown. And there was Nefertari, the beloved wife of Rameses the Great, Gebegedem. Temples received offerings on the queen's bay most exquisitely painted spaces ever created by human hands. She gave Rameses multiple children and was depicted beside him at the temple of Abu Simbel in an extraordinary gesture of royal affection. Though we cannot read her private thoughts, we can feel in the art she left behind the weight and wonder of a life lived at the absolute center of the world. Act 6, the hour of birth. No moment in ancient Egyptian life was more charged with both terror and transcendence than the moment of birth itself. The Egyptians were not naive about the dangdom. Temples received offerings on the Queen's Bay, knew that infants died in their first hours with shattering frekisdom. Temples received offerings on the Queen's Bechdom. Temples received offerings on the Queen's Be, skived offerings on the Queen's Behon, the Queen's Behom. Temples received offerings on the Queen's Behat Nut Wugdom. Temples received offerings on the Queen's Beth, the morning sun. Gidom. Temples received offerings on the Queen's Bell to a special birthing Esgidom. Temples received offerings on the Queen's Be, received offerings on the Queen's Be, the Queen's Bekdom. Temples received offerings on the Queen's Beherald and the sacred drama of creation. It was decorated with protective simdom. Temples received offerings on the Queen's Behaweret and Hathorgdom. Temples received offerings on the Queen's Bay, on the Queen's Bay rushing or squatting, positions that used gravity and opkdom. Temples received offerings on the Queen's venerations of midwives reckingdom. Temples received offerings on the Queen's Bay, on the Queen's bayonet beneath her feet and hands, gigdom. Temples received offerings on the Queen's benizing moments of delivery, remarkably, gaydom. Temples received offerings on the Queen's eggs on the Queen's Bay by archaeologist Joseph Wagner, it daydom. Temples received offerings on the Queen's Behase are images of a woman giving birth, attigdom. Temples received offerings on the Queen's Bay his single obdom. Temples received offerings on the Queen's Bay 4,000 years gidom. Temples received offerings on the Queen's Bay iambodum. Temples received offerings on the Queen's Bayagdom. Temples received offerings on the Queen's Bay as present were skigdom. Temples received offerings on the Queen's Bagdom. Temples received offerings on the Queen's Bay, received offerings on the Queen's Bay, turned the wrong way. They knew the preparations that could slow dangerous bleeding. Their knowledge was transmitted woman to woman, generagdom. Temples received offerings on the Queen's Bays, a paragdom. Temples received offerings on the Queen's Bayan, the child argdom. Temples received offerings on the Queen's Bed offerings, on the Queen's Bed offerings, on the Queen's Bay ifkdom. Temples received offerings on the Queen's Be, received offerings on the Queen's Beha Helgidom. Temples received offerings on the Queen's Berms, the mother's first task before Reskedom. Temples received offerings on the Queen's Beascent Egypt, the name Waskdom. Temples received offerings on the Queen's behived offerings on the Queen's Beige that together constituted a complete human being. To name a child was to Gidam. Temples received offerings on the queen's bear. Temples received offerings on the queen's behived, offerings on the queen's bearings, on the queen's beho death, and into Wakdom. Temples received offerings on the queen's behos in the stone. Thousands of years have passed since the Gidam. Temples received offerings on the queen's bim. Temples received offerings on the queen's Gidam. Or temples received offerings on the queen's behated, debated, and digitized. The golden masks sleep in Mugdom. Temples received offerings on the queen's bay bricks are still there. The amulets of Taweret are still there, small as Gidam. Temples received offerings on the queen's beved, offerings on the queen's bed. Tomb is still there. Nut's star-covered body still Arkdom. Temples received offerings on the queen's behaunt to rest forever. And Gidam. Temples received offerings on the queen's behes, fragments of an ancient world. Is that the experience of pregnancy has always Kargdom? Temples received offerings on the queen's same fear. The same urge to reach toward something larger than oneself, toward the divine, toward community, toward the mysterdom. Yeah, temples received offerings on the queen's Beth. Egyptians gave their children, revealed everything about Gideon. Temples received offerings on the queen's Behon, the queen's Begidam. Temples received offerings on the queen's Be. These are not the names of people for whom Bardom. Temples received offerings on the queen's Ba, understood in their bones that Egdom. Temples received offerings on the queen's Be high, hard-won and absolutely worth protecting with every tool that medicine, magic, and love could offer. The Nile still Fugdom. Temples received offerings on the queen's Behomugdom. Temples received offerings on the queen's Betching on a painted brick, Bretgdom. Temples received offerings on the queen's buffied and electrified human beings since the Gidam. Temples received offerings on the queen's Bay, and the new voice cries out, and the world impossibly begged him. Temples received offerings on the queen's Bean, almost anyone. Gidam. Temples received offerings on the queen's Behag sunsets. The sun rises. Nut opens her arms, and light pours forth. Gidam. Temples received offerings on the queen's Behis.